Afternoon, everyone. My name is Dearbhail McDonald and I'm the Group Business Editor for Independent News and Media. Recently, an RT producer asked me to confirm my title, and I said I was the Group Brexit Editor, and sometimes that's how it feels. Such is the extent of our coverage of this very important issue. It's a real honour for me to come home to my alma mater, to DCU, where I completed my Master of Arts in Journalism in 2002 to facilitate this afternoon's panel discussion on Brexit, Ireland and the future of Europe. When I was travelling out, unfortunately I missed this morning, but the conversation is absolutely live online. I know a lot of you are contributing at a hashtag DCU Brexit. But when I was travelling out this afternoon, I was reminded of an interview that I conducted with the late Peter Sutherland just shortly before the Brexit vote in late May 2016. And in what was one of Peter's last, if not his final, interviews before he fell ill, it was a huge privilege for me, he subjected me to a masterclass on the raison d'etre of the European Union and the integration process. He also subjected me to a huge lecture on what he described as the act of insanity that was Brexit. And on that Saturday afternoon in his home, he told me that his biggest fear was that the cumulative effect of Brexit would be the loosening of the bonds of the European integration process. And he had just returned that week from meeting refugees in camps in Sicily and in Greece. And he accepted that afternoon that the EU had failed to secure support in recent years as the financial crisis deepened and the migration crisis escalated. But he was unrepentant on that day and after that integration and the deepening of the European integration process was the only way. I think that the battle for the ideological heart of Europe was well underway before the two seismic events, the global financial crisis and Brexit, brought it well and truly to the fore. But where are we now? Where is Ireland and where is the future of Europe in the wake of Brexit? Where in the future will the psychological and physical barriers lie? And where is the island of Ireland in all of this? We have an absolutely superb panel of speakers to discuss that with us today. Unfortunately, Daniel Sarmiento is not able to join us, but that gives you and ourselves much more time to debate it. And I would really, already I can see there's huge debate in the audience, but we would really ask you, after our speakers have contributed, to really take part in what I hope will be a provocative and lively debate. So without further ado, I'd like you to give a warm welcome to the stage to Daniel Keleman from Rutgers University, Noelle O'Connell from European Movement Ireland, and from Etain Tannam from Trinity College Dublin. So thank you. So I'm going to ask Daniel to come up to initiate what I hope is going to be both a thought-provoking and provocative debate this afternoon before we guide you safely to the next coffee break. So Daniel, would you like to start?
Thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to Professor Fabrini for the invitation and all of you for coming. It's a privilege to be here and to follow such esteemed speakers. And given everything that's happening in my country, I'm just happy Americans are still invited to Europe. So thank you very much for that. So I'm going to talk a bit about what I think are the likely impacts of Brexit on the European Union. That's going to be my main focus. And then toward the end, I'll say a little bit about what I think this means for Ireland in particular. But I'm going to not say too much about Ireland. We have two Irish speakers who will focus more on the domestic scene here as it relates to Brexit. So, and first, really, before I get into the impact of Brexit on the EU, I should probably lay my cards on the table about something in all these conversations. One probably wonders, well, what do they think of Brexit? So let me just say something about that. You know, I would say Brexit, to me, it's a historic tragedy and act of self-harm for the UK, and it's a tragedy for the EU as well. It will cost the UK economically a great deal, also in political influence, a lot of the things we've heard about today. It will be costly for the EU as well, less so than for the UK, but costly, and then particularly costly for Ireland, given your close relationships. That being said, you know, I think it's important that we appreciate, especially now where there's all this discussion of trying to stop Brexit in the UK, second referenda, all these kind of schemes, that it was a sovereign decision of the UK to leave. In fact, that's one of the kind of ironies, right, that a lot of the momentum behind the Leave movement talked about the EU infringing on Britain's sovereignty, which was, of course, always false and was proven definitively by the fact that the EU is not a prison. You're allowed to leave, which is why I would agree very much with what Hilary Benn was saying, that I think Brexit cannot and should not be stopped. As much as we might be unhappy with the decision to hold a referendum, the conditions under which it was held, and the procedures, the understanding was if the vote was to leave, they would leave, and so I think that has to happen. Okay, so what impact is Brexit likely to have on the future development of the EU? Okay? And where is Europe heading in the wake of Brexit? Well, first, let's dispense with the obvious here on the point I would call sort of disappointing the doubters. There were a lot of doubters, people sort of suggest, those who doubt the EU, who had fears that Brexit would lead to a domino effect of other countries following the UK out the door. You all remember reading about that in the papers, people saying, well, who's the next country to leave if Britain leaves, et cetera. But instead, we've seen, as some of the earlier speakers remarked on, a remarkable upsurge in public support for the EU for the EU in member states around the Union, including in the UK, actually. And I'll just put it plainly, no one else is going, I can't see any other state leaving the EU. Even some of the states, which I'll get to later, which are in the biggest tensions with the EU, states like Poland and Hungary, they're not going to leave. And we'd have to go through each case, and the specifics of why. In some cases, it's the money they get. But the overriding fact is that none of the other national populations would support leaving. So that's number one. Brexit is not going to lead to a dissolution of the EU or any kind of domino effect. Now, how about on the other extreme, you had some people saying, oh, actually, Brexit will be fine because the UK has been such a brake on deeper integration. Some really ardent sort of Euro-federalists said, finally we'll be able to pursue the integration that Britain was stopping us from pursuing. Now, it's true that the UK was very, very often acted as a kind of brake or the most reluctant member state for advancing integration on various issues from defense to taxation to various areas of market regulation. And whenever you release a brake, it's natural you would expect some acceleration. And I think we will see that. We've already seen it in defense with the agreement on PESCO. But I don't think one should get too excited about that if one favors deeper integration, because we're not going to have any sudden surge forward toward dramatically deeper patterns of integration just because the UK is left. Because, in fact, there's enough disagreement among the remaining 27 states when you go issue by issue that others will emerge as likely blockers of integration on many issues. So, well, where does that leave us then? Which model going forward? Well, as other speakers have alluded to, the Commission in its white paper on the future of Europe proposed various models. Commission President Juncker followed up with various discussion papers. We've had Macron's model. So, which of these models seems likely to be the one that will emerge going forward? Well, first thing I want to say is there's been a lot of attention paid in these discussions to this variable geometry sort of model. You may have seen this graph. This floats around on the internet in different forums. Sorry, it's gotten a little blurry. But and in this model of a sort of multi-speed Europe, some people say, well, those who want to do more should be able to go ahead and do more, not being held back by the reluctant. And the point I want to make about that is that for those who are seizing on that as the new model or the likely model of development for the EU, the first point to make is that's nothing new for the EU. As you can see in this chart, we've had multi-speed, sometimes called variable geometry, sometimes called differentiated integration. We've had that in the EU for many years, and we still will have it, it's true. But to think that that will suddenly become the dominant model, to me doesn't make any sense, because who was the state that was very often the driver of the necessity for multi-speed arrangements? Who was the state who multi-speed arrangements were designed to accommodate? Well, that was usually the UK, right, very often. So the biggest demandeur of multi-speed arrangements was usually the UK, so it only stands to reason that in a post-Brexit world, that model would not become more likely or more dominant, right? So there'll still be elements of it there, but instead, I think what we will see is more of a convergence around the Eurozone core. Again, there will be areas of some states having opt-outs, some states moving ahead, in smaller groups, but I wouldn't expect it to be become more of a dominant model. Rather, we will see more convergence around the Eurozone core, with states that aren't in that core feeling more sucked into it. That being said, this was my effort at concentric circles and a two-speed Europe, right? That I don't think we should expect, which is another model some people suggest, okay, that we're going to have a new grand design to simplify all this mess and just have a two-speed Europe of a Eurozone core and then, let's say, a broader group of countries who are just in the single market. I can talk about that maybe more in the Q&A why, but I don't see that emerging. Instead, I think we'll have basically this still somewhat messy model that we saw before. So then how are things going to move forward? Now, I wish I could agree with, well, I do agree with former President Van Rompuy's sentiment that it would be good if the member states could avoid just making decisions, as he said, when their back is against the wall, when the abyss is in front, when the knife is at their neck, right? And that instead they could, in a more rational way, plan out when to take these big steps forward to kind of complete the incomplete aspects of EU institutions, to avoid crises from happening. That would be desirable. Unfortunately, my study of the EU over the years doesn't lead me to believe it's very likely, as desirable as it might be. Instead, I frankly think the EU will continue to kind of muddle through the way it has, or sometimes what I call, it'll engage in a pattern of failing forward. So in other words, it will continue to bump up against crises, right, that are perceived as policy failures, breakdowns, as we've seen with the Eurozone crisis, as we've seen with the refugee crisis. And then in response to those, it will undertake institutional reforms to deepen. Now, that's a very unsatisfying, suboptimal, ugly way for the EU to go about its business, but it hasn't been an entire failure as a modus operandi. If we just think about it for a second, we've talked in recent years about this polycrisis, right? Or sometimes I call it a perfect storm of all these intersecting crises, which I just mentioned in the EU. But despite the fact that the EU went through that, if we take a step back and ask what was the net effect of that on the deepening of the EU, the net effect has been an incredible deepening. The EU has seen its authority extended in the past decade in ways that would have just been unimaginable, right? When you think of the centralization in areas like banking supervision, the Eurozone bailout fund, the ESM, the greater control over fiscal policy, the establishment of a European border and coast guard, all these things. So going forward, what are the areas I see deepening to be most likely in? We heard this mentioned from some of the speakers, some of the areas that are encapsulated in the phrase you hear a lot from the Commission these days, une Europe qui protège, a Europe that protects, right? So things like stronger common defense, more on border control, counterterrorism, things like that, along with reform of the Eurozone, which Merkel and Macron look set to push forward now. Those will be some of the most likely areas of deepening going forward. And then the one other area, I think, of deepening, which we haven't really touched on in the discussion so far today, but I think is important to touch on, is with respect to democracy at the EU level, right? So there's a lot of calls that the EU needs to further democratize. And I think that will happen. We're going to see in the next round of the European Parliament election the Spitzenkandidat process rehashed, if you remember that, this process where the majority winner or the plurality winner of the vote in the European Parliament, that party or party group determines who's going to become the Commission president. That's what they did last time. I think they're going to do it again. More generally, I think we'll see the European Parliament continue to become more powerful, and European political parties, or sometimes called party groups, these EU-level parties, they will become more powerful. Now, all of this is designed in a way, and the way it's framed is this is making Europe more democratic by giving voters a clear choice so they know, who are they voting for, who's going to run the EU, so there's not a sense that there's only one policy choice out there, let's say austerity or whatever issue, that rather there's real political choice for voters at the EU level. And that is, of course, desirable. But I'd like to issue one warning that be careful what you wish for, because party politics are an ugly business, supranationally just as they are nationally. And what we've seen already, and this is an irony, a little teaser thought I'll throw out, I can't develop it fully for you, but that I think paradoxically, the greater partisan politics at the EU level and greater political contestation for control of the Commission and those things actually is generating incentives for European-level parties to tolerate national autocracies, right? So if you want to ask, why does the EU not do more about Viktor Orban in Hungary as he takes his regime in an anti-democratic direction, I'd say that's actually tied with the effort to democratize politics at the EU level, because it leads the European People's Party, right, the center-right party, to want to protect Orban because they need his votes and his support at the EU level, right? And so then they tolerate his misdeeds because he's part of their coalition. And I think that's going to raise questions for a lot of national governments, Ireland's and others, about when do they tolerate, when are they willing to be parts of coalitions with unsavory governments? Because this issue of the rise of autocratic government at the national level in countries like Hungary, Poland, now Romania is looking shaky, is, I think, the big crisis on the horizon for the EU, which will make Brexit look like, let's say, easy work in comparison, really. Now, the last thing, do I have 1 minute left or so? Okay. I said I'd say something about Ireland. So I just want to end with a couple thoughts about Ireland. And some of this was touched on by speakers already. But you may have seen this sort of impossible trinity floats around the internet. And really what I want to talk to you about is the question, which promise is Theresa May going to break? Okay? She's made incompatible promises, as you heard. I had a British philosophy professor when I was an undergrad. I remember he talked about the concept of uncosatisfiable desires. When you want various things, you can't have them all at once. Well, trade agreements with non-EU countries, that's something they want to be able to do, right? They want no free movement for EU workers, and they want no border in Ireland. But you see in the middle where those overlap, that's called La La Land, right? That doesn't exist. This is the one that floats around the internet, but I made my own. I would frame the impossible trinity slightly differently. She's promised to leave the single market and the customs union. She's promised no border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And she's promised no border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, okay? So in Zone A, right, she can have, so you can't have all three, I should just say. D in the middle doesn't exist. That's impossible. So which promise is she going to break? Is she going to betray her promise to the DUP and have effectively a border in the Irish Sea? And that's going to cause, of course, a conflagration in the UK, and it's going to make Irish unification much more likely in the next 10 to 20 years, let's say, right? Or is she going to have a border on Ireland, violating the Good Friday Agreement? Ireland's then going to veto any Brexit deal. That'll be a mess. Or she could say, no, I'm going to stay in the customs union and single market, what Hilary Benn suggested, but then there's going to be a Tory Brexiteer revolt, her government's going to fall, the Conservative Party is going to split in two. If you asked me, which I would guess she'll break her promise to the DUP and put a border in the Irish Sea, but I'm not a gambling man. I'll leave it to you to decide what you think. And finally, what is the outcome? This is my very last slide. If you haven't seen this before, this is a bit fuzzy for you, but be sure to look up after talk. Michel Barnier, the EU's lead negotiator, his famous slide where he just shows all the options. And the point of this slide is that all the options about relationships between the EU, and therefore between Ireland and the UK, have been blocked by red lines imposed by the British, not by the EU. So, you go from membership to EEA membership, that's the sort of Norway model, to a Swiss model, to a Ukraine association agreement, to membership in the customs union. Point is, the one you're led to inexorably, right, is just to have a free trade agreement like the EU has with Canada or Korea. So that's where I think the relationship is going to end up. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you very, very much. We might leave it up to you to tell the DUP which promise Theresa May is going to break. But now back to Ireland and to Noelle O'Connell from the European movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dearbhail. Hard act to follow, Daniel. You might send on those slides. They might be very useful for future reference. Thank you very much. As Dara mentioned earlier, ladies and gentlemen, today is National Day of Compliments, I think he mentioned. So in that regard, I would like to thank President Brian McGrath, Federico and all his colleagues here in the DCU Brexit Institute for inviting me to address you all and for enabling European Movement Ireland to partner with DCU and the Brexit Institute today. And I think what you'd all agree has been an extremely insightful, timely and informative conference. So what I'm hoping to do today in the time that I have available, or the time that Dearbhail permits me, if I go over, I'm sure I'll be summoned to task, I'll be warned. I would like to maybe outline some of European Movement Ireland's perspectives on Ireland's evolving relationship with the EU, and also, I suppose, look at the Irish approach to this debate on the future of Europe, and similar to many of the speakers this morning, pose some questions and some teasers that might get us all thinking on questions and topics that are not going to go away, and I think it's important that we have a look at them, because as we approach what is a critical juncture in the EU's evolution, and it is one that will shape our future for decades to come, it is important that events and conferences such as these to catalyse, inform and provide a forum for research, analysis from academia, civil society and business on the developing of European policies, debate and dialogue continue to take place. So I'd like to congratulate DCU and the DCU Brexit Institute for their very timely initiative. This, of course, and this engagement and this debate must happen alongside by proactively engaging with all citizens, and that proactive is the crucial word here. We need a bottom-up approach to seek to hear their views, their concerns, and to, above all, to listen, because we have an opportunity and we have a responsibility to shape and influence the future evolution of the European Union. And this actually in 2018 will form much of European Movement Ireland's focus. But of course, as we look forward to the future, we need to cast an eye back to the past and look at where we've come from and the journey that we have taken to date. Our organisation was founded in 1954, and we are the longest established not-for-profit membership organisation dedicated to developing that connection between Ireland and Europe. Our original objective was to advocate for Irish membership of the European Economic Community, but alongside that, we have always, as an organisation, been ambitious to advocate for more active and engaged involvement by Irish people in what was then the EC and now the EU, and to continue to encourage our contribution as a people at all levels about how to better progress and influence the European project. This was mirrored in the statements of European and Irish political leaders at the time. If I just maybe refer to one, Sean Lemass in 1962, he said, "The political aims of the community are aims to which the Irish government and people are ready to subscribe and in the realisation of which they wish to play an active part." This may seem like a contradictory divergence into history from the topic that we are here to discuss today, namely the future, but I'm struck at how pertinent and how relevant this still remains in the context of the current ongoing debate in Europe. Ireland may have progressed to varying degrees, one could argue, to the adulthood of our European life, but we are now also entering a new period and a new phase and a new stage of our European Union membership. This is one that requires us to think anew about which direction we would like the European Union to travel in. It is looking and forcing us to think beyond Brexit and look at fundamental questions. What do we want as a people and as a country the EU to look like in 5, 10, 30 years' time? How do we want to shape and influence it? How involved do we want to be? How active do we want to be? And forgive me, I know he's already been quoted earlier today, but I couldn't allow the occasion to pass without once more referring to Jean Monnet, who once said that the route that we take is less important than the direction we travel in. And the Future of Europe debate offers us all the opportunity to reinvigorate the purpose of the EU, and Ireland has a role and a responsibility to play a crucial and vital part to this reinvigoration. We have been on a journey itself here in Ireland, and it's an ever-evolving one in terms of our EU relationship. Following our original accession in our early years of membership, we grew and prospered as a country and as a people. And as we began to modernise and moved away from our dependency on our nearest neighbour, the UK. Moving on to the Celtic Tiger years, we became perhaps a little bit more complacent in our relationship with the European Union, a little bit more aloof, a little bit more confident, and a little less engaged. However, fast forwarding on to the well-charted difficulties of the financial crisis and the upcoming and imminent departure of our nearest neighbour around the EU table, Ireland is now faced with seeking a new roadmap and a place for ourselves in a European Union. This is a European Union that has many challenges, as speakers have already documented, on our eastern and western borders, and a union that itself has internal challenges, difficulties, but also opportunities in a rapidly changing, yet still, notwithstanding everything, an interconnected global order. That debate on the future of Europe, as Minister McEntee outlined, affords us an opportunity to develop that vision, and that is a large part of why we in European Movement Ireland are engaging in the Irish Citizen Dialogues as part of this process. It's important that we do so because the Irish population overwhelmingly sees its future in that European Union. Mr. Van Rompuy referred to earlier our European Movement Ireland Red C polls, and I was chatting to him over lunch, and he referred to it as Stalinist levels of support. I'm not quite sure if it's Stalinist levels of support, but it's very high and it's very welcome, so we are pleased with that. It is something that we have been doing as an organisation in commissioning Red C to conduct an independent survey of the Irish public's views on Europe and a variety of matters. And it has remained very high and fluctuated since 2013 when we first started doing these surveys, peaking at 90% in 2016, but remaining in the high 80s ever since then. This is also borne out by Eurobarometer polls, and I think some of the polls that Dearbhail and her colleagues in The Independent have also carried out. There is little evidence that the Irish public support the view that we should follow the UK out of the EU. Indeed, support for this idea has reduced from 29% in 2013, when we originally posited the question, to just 16% last year. However, no matter these high figures, we shouldn't rest complacent nor take this support for granted, as our nearest neighbours across the water can attest to the damages and the conflicts that over 40 years of negative discourse and debate can possibly lead to. And the looming loss of a member state, one of the largest both in terms of population and GDP, and our closest neighbour and friend, for the first time in the EU's history, combined with the rise of populist parties, as already been referenced to by the President earlier today, has hastened the EU to look at itself and begin a process of reform and reconnection in both the institutions and the member states. Given that we here in Ireland will be the remaining member state most adversely affected by the UK decision to vote to leave the EU, our focus has understandably been on all things Brexit. However, we must remember that in many of the other member states, their focus is on a number of different matters and the future of Europe process. We saw an example of this in President Macron's widely covered speech at the Sorbonne University. This time last year, we surveyed our international network, which saw 90% support in recognition and understanding that Ireland will be the member state most uniquely affected and impacted by Brexit. However, 52% of those councils surveyed saw Brexit as a priority. So Brexit was not the priority in the majority of our councils across the European Movement International Network. And that's a really important point of information, I think, that we in Ireland must remember. We cannot and should not concentrate all our efforts and all our focus on our relationship with Europe through Brexit-tinted glasses. We need to have conversations as to how we want the EU to develop beyond Brexit and how we want to shape and influence it. And quite frankly, we need to start having these conversations now. For example, where do we stand on potential pan-European voting lists in the upcoming European Parliament elections in 2019? I know Taoiseach Leo Varadkar recently spoke in favour of transnational lists just last week in Strasbourg, saying that it would improve democracy and get people in cafes in Naples and restaurants in Galway talking about the same election choices. We also need to think and assess how do we feel and what do we consider about greater European integration in the area of security and defence? Daniel already mentioned PESCO. How do we see the future functioning of the Eurozone? What are our views on the migration crisis? These are wide-ranging and critically important questions. We must interrogate our views on these issues. In order to have a say on their development, we must, of course, be a little clearer on our own position, or perhaps less ambiguous. If we look at security and defence, if I go back to our 2015 Red Sea poll, following President Juncker mooting of whether there should be an EU army, when we posed that question to Irish people, 67% disagreed that there should be an EU army or that Ireland should be a part of it. However, when we asked the related but somewhat different question last year of whether Ireland should be part of an increased EU security and defence cooperation mechanism, 57% agreed that Ireland should be. I think the moving and shifting in those percentages, notwithstanding that polls are not scientific, I'm sure academic colleagues would say, and they are but a snapshot in time, but they do demonstrate the complexity and the multifaceted challenges underpinning these questions and debates. They are complex, and as a country, our answers to them may well be nuanced. I'll conclude on this note. Dearbhail already mentioned him, but in one of his last interviews, Peter Sutherland, who we were fortunate in European Movement Ireland to count him as one of our friends, patrons, and long-standing honorary presidents, he remarked that Europe was at the time the crucial element in providing us in Ireland with a future. He was referring, of course, to the Sutherland report, which looked at how best to implement the 1992 programme of EU reforms. As we look to our future in the context of Brexit and our role in the future of Europe, Peter's words still remain true. The question is, what do we in Ireland want this joint future to look like? There is an onus and a responsibility on us all to be brave, and let's not be afraid to have these conversations now.
Very, very much, Noelle. And finally, before we go to the open debate, Etain, if you'd like to take the stage, thanks. Thanks, Noelle.
So good afternoon, everyone, and I think I have an even harder act to follow now, but Simon Coveney's on his way, so things will get better. I would like to thank the DCU Brexit Institute, particularly Federico Fabbrini, Professor Fabbrini, for inviting me here, and also President McGrath and the European Movement as well for their involvement. I think it's just been an amazing success, and I'm flattered to be here, honoured to be here. I'm going to talk about the British-Irish intergovernmental relationship and the diplomatic relationship in a way because at previous sessions of the Brexit Institute, and I think you're all aware in the media and in our whole environment, the border issue is specifically being talked about very often. John Doyle and Eileen Connolly of DCU and also Brenda Daly, colleagues of Professor Fabbrini, have given very in-depth and excellent presentations on the border. The argument I'm presenting here is that the British-Irish intergovernmental relationship is equally important, and in fact, I wouldn't say more important, but it has been central to the peace process. It has been an essential condition. It has really driven the success of the Good Friday Agreement and the Anglo-Irish Agreement before that in 1985, and it sometimes gets less attention because it's not the immediate focus. But the argument is that Brexit also threatens cooperation in the British-Irish relationship, which is central to stability in Northern Ireland. I always make a mess of PowerPoint. Oh, I didn't. Okay. Okay, so just the significance. In a way, it's easy to forget, but if we go back to the early 80s, for those of us who remember the early 80s, there was often very much hardline rhetoric and megaphone diplomacy in response to various crises, such as the Falklands War and the H-Block hunger strike, where 13 IRA people, citizens or individuals died. And rhetoric was very hardline, and relations were obviously very poor and were seen as very negative. It was in response partly to that collapse of communication. there was very limited communication between the heads of government at the time, and partly in response to past policy failures, such as the Sunningdale Agreement, the conflict itself, violence in Northern Ireland, an increase in violence occurring, that there was a change in strategy in British-Irish policy and in the diplomatic relationship. So we see from the 1980s joint decision-making emerging, joint problem solving, and gradually a very consensual approach to policy making between British and Irish governments, which really culminated in the 1990s and culminated in the Good Friday Agreement. There was also a very strategic approach. It wasn't an ad hoc, responsive, back against the wall policy, to cite the previous speaker earlier this afternoon, Van Rompuy. Policy was based really on achieving a long-term aim, which was stability and peace in Northern Ireland. And also there was a very basic assumption, which is those of us who are academics in international relations theory would be familiar with, and others, a basic assumption that institutionalizing a relationship leads to further cooperation. So that was kind of the hypothesis, but in this case it was a practical policy, that if both governments were obliged to meet regularly, regardless of the crisis they faced, there would be a better solution, a better ability to solve the crisis. And what was important there was the obligation to meet, because what had happened in the early 80s was that when there was a crisis, communication became less frequent. So the emphasis, again from lesson learning, was that when there was a crisis, leaders of governments and governments should meet more regularly, and therefore it was institutionalized through the Anglo-Irish Agreement. It was a formal obligation. The strategy that emerged, that again we're probably all familiar with, was a carrot and stick strategy towards the main players in Northern Ireland, incentives to enable them to cooperate, and sticks if they didn't. So the incentive of power of devolved government in a peaceful Northern Ireland, and the stick that you wouldn't get that seat at the table democratically in a government if you didn't. The European Union was central. I assume maybe I haven't, it was so obvious, but the European Union was a central framework in developing this relationship as well. And the recent post on the DCU Brexit blog, which I've written, really looks at that also. Without that EU framework, I think the notion of non-zero-sum policy making would have been less familiar and less easy to deliver. So we see a flourishing relationship that we're all familiar with, the Queen's visit, President Higgins' state visit, which was mentioned this morning, to the UK, and the setting up of here a formalised institution of permanent senior civil servants who would meet once a year. And there was an emphasis on the relationship now being normal. It wasn't just about Northern Ireland anymore. British-Irish relations were about the cultural links, emigration to the UK, the economic links that were strongly emphasised by David Cameron, who was then Prime Minister. Reflecting the success of the peace process and really of a sort of perception that Northern Ireland was no longer the burning issue, we see through this normalisation less use made of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement. So the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference became less central, which was the institution allowing Irish and British governments to meet over non-devolved issues, particularly of relevance to nationalists in Northern Ireland. That became less central. Staff were depleted from it, and it hasn't met, which is something I'll mention again. It hasn't met since the Brexit referendum. We also see the British-Irish Council, which was mentioned earlier today, another Good Friday Agreement British-Irish governmental institution, also representing the Crown dependencies in the UK, Wales as well, and Scotland. And that was really only attended by Tony Blair on the British side in terms of prime ministerial attendance. A representative has been sent ever since. Irish prime ministers have always attended. So we see the different emphasis there, which is understandable given the British, larger state, bigger, in some ways, policy domain, and Irish prioritisation more of Northern Ireland. So implications of Brexit. There are practical ones, and there are the broader normative ones to do with losing that common framework, that non-zero-sum tradition that the EU has taught us, the consensual approach. Ireland and the UK are obviously no longer on the same team. And we saw that, we have seen it since the Brexit referendum, but we've seen it since summer 2017 very clearly. Ireland is in the team of 27, the UK is on the other side, and there have been problems in communication and in sharing of information. It's not adversarial in the way by saying the other side sounds very negative, but clearly there have been communication issues and problems. There have been fears on both the EU and the Irish side that Northern Ireland would be used as a pawn to allow the UK get concessions on trade, so that it would be used in this way that it would be connected. So in other words, if the border issue was resolved satisfactorily to the Irish government, it would be linked to achieving a satisfactory trade deal for the British government that would not necessarily meet EU preferences. Apart from that, Ireland and the UK have been allies in the EU. They have shared many preferences on economic issues and on political issues, and now that has gone. Ireland has lost an ally, which is another issue in terms of its diplomacy more broadly in the EU, but also it just removes a common framework and a common set of interests that are no longer there. So the sources of potential tension and actual tension are very real, and they have emerged very quickly. Arguably, though, it could have been avoided. So arguably, better management of Brexit, better communication on the British side could have minimised some of these downsides, not obliterated them, but at least minimised them. But to use the phrase from Daniel of Perfect Storm, the weakness of the UK government and the mismanagement of Brexit generally has had implications, obviously, for relations with the Irish government. So what was already not a good situation or a bad one became much worse because of that. There have been very few one-to-one prime ministerial meetings between British and Irish prime ministers, again going back to this central assumption that in a crisis that elite level communication is needed. That has not occurred. There's been no meeting of this relatively new senior civil servant group that's meant to meet every year. That hasn't met since the Brexit referendum. The British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, as I said, has not met either. And there are reasons for that, which perhaps we can understand. It is related to Northern Ireland non-devolved issues, but at the same time, you could see there would be wiggle room to include Brexit in many ways in that. It is also a sensitive issue for unionists in Northern Ireland who have never been that keen on it, as they see it as representing Irish influence in Northern Ireland and potentially a step to Irish unity. So it's always sensitive, but they did agree to it in the Good Friday Agreement. Eventually for the DUP, and it is there, but it has not been used. We see practical manifestations of the weakening of the relationship in the summer. Last summer, the UK government announced it was leaving the Fisheries Convention, which was signed in 1964, allowing access to fishery waters within a certain range, which I can't remember, around the island of Ireland and around the UK. They withdrew, and what's noteworthy here, apart from withdrawing, which was related to fisheries interests and delivering for them, because they were, in the main, they were Brexiteers, so it was domestically, politically driven. But what was noteworthy was it was communicated to the Irish government via the British Embassy in Dublin. It was not communicated directly to the Irish government. And the Minister for Agriculture, Michael Creed in Ireland, said he actually only heard about it through the media. So in terms of diplomacy and the strong, flourishing relationship which I referred to, this was really quite a break and not positive. It can be explained in various ways, particularly, as I said, that the UK government is in disarray. It has its own domestic political problems. It's burdened at the complexity of what it's trying to do, which has been touched upon today already. The trade deals it envisages with non-EU countries, which do not seem realisable in many ways, as well as bargaining Brexit with the EU, as well as dealing specifically with Northern Ireland as part of that, we can see it's overburdened. So you can see practical reasons, not Machiavellian ones, why this may be the case, but the end result is the same. It's definitely a weakening in the relationship. I would argue, and it seems directly the case, in response to the lack of communication, in response to the lack of clarity about the UK's Brexit plans, Irish government rhetoric stepped up and became more hardline. And rhetoric and language were used that really haven't been used since the 80s, very sort of wasn't below the radar, it was out there in the media. from the Irish Taoiseach and from the Minister for Foreign Affairs, more blunt language was used in the various examples of that. I suppose before I end, which I will do so soon, I don't want to glorify the past as this sort of golden era from the 80s onwards. There were divisions of opinion intermittently, divisions of opinion about decommissioning in the St Andrews Agreement in 2006, other issues about the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, but they were dealt with quite diplomatically, subtly below the radar. The difference now is the way it's quite overt, as in past eras. And also, obviously, the challenges are ongoing. This is not just a single issue. This is Brexit, which involves so many issues that are very complex, to do with the protection of the Good Friday Agreement, to do with peace in Northern Ireland, and economics, obviously, as well. Again, not to be too black and white, blunt rhetoric, isn't the only indicator of cooperation or conflict. It's a strategy, and that's understandable as well, given that until December it was unclear what the British government was going to do about Northern Ireland. There were perceptions, or it was argued it was dividing and conquering, trying to get support from other EU states to allow progress to phase 2 of the negotiations, even if the Irish government didn't think the Northern Ireland border issue was resolved satisfactorily. So there are all these reasons why it could be a short-term strategy. But the problem is it fundamentally does reflect a new context, as I said, with various conflicts of interest and challenges, and they're not going to go away. And also, even if leaders on both sides realize that rhetoric is just rhetoric or it's a strategy, it incites public opinion. We can see the media accounts in the UK at various times sort of regressing again to a different era in terms of depictions of Leo Varadkar as our Irish Taoiseach and Irishness and various sort of tabloid press language. And in Ireland, it's amazing, I think, also how quickly old memories come back of, the various articles on, nostalgia for the British Empire causing Brexit, which Hilary Benn's analysis today was quite different. It was about economics and exclusion of certain groups in the UK. But in Ireland, anecdotally at least, those of you on Twitter would see this too, there's been a latching on to the idea of the UK having these imperial sort of legacies still. So I think it brings back old things very quickly, and Dearbhail was talking about psychological aspects. I think that's a very, very sensitive area for everyone, which is also damaging. So rhetoric may be just strategic, but it does incite emotions. And President Higgins talked about the negative side of nationalism as opposed to the idea of having more global empathy with people in other places. So I am finishing. These are just a few prescriptions. Maybe they're not prescriptions, more dilemmas. I suppose given that ability for it to cause emotional reactions, there's also the potential for Brexit to become a political football. Already we see that in the UK, obviously with the very referendum itself. But in Ireland too, there is a potential for playing a strong hand against the UK to reignite that old relationship with the UK and to win votes. So that has to be resisted, to go back to any of the more conflictual aspects of nationalism. Because as President Higgins mentioned, there can also be positives in a positive sense of nationalism. Intensive management then of the relationship and leadership of public opinion in a positive way is essential, but yet at the same time making it clear to the UK government from the Irish side that Northern Ireland is an issue that must be dealt with to its satisfaction. So there's this core dilemma of having to be hardline if that message is not getting through versus minimizing conflict and negative nationalism on both sides. So thank you very much. Thank you.
I think what was interesting about those tabloid depictions of Ireland was that they weren't restricted to the tabloid press only in the UK. And what I felt was kind of quite frightening this year was the level to which the rhetoric and language and those old ways of depicting each other just seemed to deteriorate so rapidly. Etain, I might just on that maybe just go to you first for a question, because here we are on the eve of the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which coincides with a full year of political paralysis in the north. And we've seen kind of quite quickly how, like, I mean, your first prescription about how, you know, that no party should be able to exploit, the Brexit should not be able to exploit it. I think that is already happening to some extent, and there's an urgent need to curb that. But what is the way out? And in terms of that, what I seem to be picking up was a potential lack of commitment on the British side to re-engage with those institutions. What do we need to do to get that vital relationship back on track? Because we've seen just how quickly things can revert.
I suppose the institutionalised point I made about institutions is vital, but I put that to a retired member of the Cabinet Office in London, and he said institutions are useless unless there's political will. So it's very much a catch-22 situation, but my argument would still be, going back to the 80s, in terms of a learning process, that political will was the problem then at times as well, but the institutions did manage to overcome that. So I would still say we have to get to a point where the institutions are being used. I don't think we can rely on the informal contacts which developed organically in the 90s through very good relations. I don't think we can necessarily rely on them anymore. So I think we need to think in terms of the 80s scenario and deepen, either create new institutions or use the Good Friday Agreement ones, perhaps, if it's politically acceptable to all concerned more effectively. And that will entail in itself, arguably, a push for that from the Irish government, because, as I've said, the British government is not either in a position or does not have, perhaps, the political will to engage in the way it did with the Irish government. So I would say it would need to be central to the overall sort of strategy going forward as regards Brexit.
And do you support it kind of just in the same way as the Good Friday Agreement in essence was a bespoke agreement that allowed for a lot of creative ambiguity?
Yeah.
Do you think that there is capacity or room for that kind of a bespoke and creative, you know, ambiguity to allow those, because the issues of identity, of politics and of those borders?
Yeah, I would think there is. I mean, I don't know if there are any foreign affairs staff here from the Irish department, but I would think there is, that there should be that creative ambiguity, and that there is, if there's a push for that I think existing institutions could be used to resolve some of these issues on identity, Good Friday Agreement issues, the right, as was mentioned, I think, by Hilary Benn this morning, the fact that citizens in Northern Ireland can be British or Irish, so therefore they, you know, all those kind of issues. But also the consultative mechanisms the agreement has provided, which are not really being used at the moment.
Absolutely. I want to flip over to Daniel and ask you this. If nobody's getting kicked out, nobody's leaving. And potentially, one of your predictions, which is quite frightening, is that there'll be a greater strengthening of the parties at a European level that will tolerate what you've described as national autocracies. How is the European Union and its integration process going to deal with those who don't want to play by the rules, whatever about the single market and other central pillars, but on essential social and democratic issues, whether it's Poland, whether it's Hungary, or other issues? And how is the EU going to resolve that if we're all in, apart from the UK?
Well, that's going to be up to Europeans, but I would say this. I can say what I think parties should do, right, and member states in the Council should do. But the lessons of other kind of quasi-federal or federal systems when it comes to the tolerance of local authoritarianism, you know, in a state, or in the EU's case, it would be in a country, is not encouraging. So take my country. We tolerated authoritarian government for a century, right? After Reconstruction in the South, they reimposed Jim Crow and basically were running one-party authoritarian states, disenfranchising people. You know, they had elections, but they weren't fair and things. And so, you know, and meanwhile, we were the world's great democracy, right? And so the EU, you know, if we see, let's hope it doesn't happen, but if we would see, let's say, the style of governance, drift more and more towards authoritarianism in some of these countries in the East we're talking about, Hungary or Poland, you know, you've all seen in the papers the standoff with Poland right now. If it drifts more in that direction, I'd say this: if the EU tolerates it, it wouldn't be unprecedented, right? But that doesn't excuse it, right? And I guess the way I think about it is, I don't know, the Euro crisis, lost a lot of money, right? Brexit, it's kind of like losing a member of your family and losing a lot of money, right? But if the EU tolerates really autocratic governments and doesn't do something very firm about it, then it loses its immortal soul, right? Go back to the inspiring talk by your president about the reasons the union was founded. Peace was, of course, a big part of it, but it was also about not just peace, but also a zone of democracy and freedom, right? And so to tolerate a drift away from that, I think would be very problematic. And I think, for a country that's, we all have our problems, every democracy is imperfect, but Ireland's a quite healthy democracy, robust democracy, I'd say. And I think even though it's a small country, for countries like that, there's opportunity to speak up, right? Just the way, like President Macron has spoken up quite loudly about this issue, and naturally France is a big country, leading country, but smaller states also, by the power of their example and their model and the values they stand for, I think can have a powerful voice.
Yeah, very good. I always thought Brexit was like watching your second cousins have a row and the entire family fell apart. And we're like, what? But like many of you this morning, I woke up to the not quite dulcet, because we're quite strong tones of the Dutch politician Paul Tang depicting Ireland as tax pirates, and it was just like, oh, here we go yet again. Obviously Brian Hayes and others were out in defence of that. But Noelle, Brexit is altering the map within Europe, and Ireland has defined a story and a narrative for itself within that. Our diplomats and others are quickly recalibrating, trying to do that and to seek new coalitions. My colleague Brendan Keenan, actually my predecessor as business editor, wrote a great comment this morning on our business pages saying Ireland has to tell its story as this map is being redrawn. But one of the things he says, look, there's going to be lots of discussion of great political matters, new structures, fiscal, financial, economic issues. These are likely to dominate. But he says, unless we can give a better account of ourselves than in the past, we will lose out. So how do we see ourselves, and what is going to be Ireland's story, both internally and externally, as it goes forward to ensure that we don't lose out? Because we are now, geographically a smaller outlier than somewhere like Estonia.
How long do I have?
do you know what? I'm not saying anything again. I've clearly developed this reputation as some ruthless timekeeper, but people who get to their coffee breaks appreciate it. Okay. And we're doing fine for time. You can talk away.
Not at all. No, I'm only jesting. Dearbhail, you've hit the nail on the head. I think for many of us, we all remember where we were 23rd of June 2016 and the aftermath, and all has changed utterly. And the complexities and the challenges that Brexit has forced upon us, I think, is significant. And as you said, where in Ireland do we see ourselves? We are obviously going to be very affected by the loss of our closest neighbour and our long-standing ally. But I think sometimes we forget that we are part of a union and we are part of a club. So we're not totally isolationist, notwithstanding our geographical peripheral nature. The fact that Irish concerns were prioritised in phase one and the level of activity and engagement and at all levels by our government, by political leaders of all hues, by our civil servants across, not just in Brussels, London, but across the EU member states. It's been a national effort, and also I think business associations, civil society groups. It reminded me of the time, I don't know if many of you remember, but the time of the BCSE and that kind of collective putting our shoulder to the wheel. And I think what we need to do as a country and as a people is not take our foot off the pedal. It absolutely is causing us to question and debate and have these grown-up and tricky conversations about topics that we mightn't have been as comfortable about having that full and frank discussion with before. I think, we talk about security and defence. You mentioned the T word. I would just say on the whole tax issue, if anything, and Daniel, of course, can refer to it from the American perspective, but we live in such an increasingly globalised world. Ireland, with its 5 million population, we can't solve the tax problems on our own. It's going to have to be part of a bigger debate and dialogue, not just at EU level, but at a larger level. But there is an opportunity for us to have that debate and dialogue. And I think that's why these citizen dialogues that we're having throughout the country will be a really important means of actually kind of tapping into what people feel and what type of future do we want to shape and influence the direction of the EU, and how do we see ourselves? And I think there are going to be challenges, but I think we're up to it.
Because every relationship involves give and take, and you know, a lot of people feel, well, is it going to be the case that for the extraordinary commitment that we've seen from Europe on the Irish and the Northern Ireland question, what's going to be the quid pro quo? And one of the things I thought was quite interesting about the Taoiseach speech recently on Europe was his remarks, and I think actually they were quite overlooked in everything else, just on the whole area of competition. I'll just read it out. He said, whatever the future holds, Europe needs to be competitive economically. And it did sound as if it was going to be yet another defence of our tax proposition. But he says one of the ways to ensure this is by having competition amongst member states, particularly important for peripheral and less developed countries. And I kind of think, you know, sometimes, you know, harmony doesn't always necessarily mean harmonisation. So it'd be welcome, Daniel, for your views and others on, you know, do we have something to give? You know, it mightn't be the loudest voice or even amplified by the UK anymore, but where do you kind of, do you have any views on the future of Ireland within that as a central but in one sense peripheral nation?
Well, yes, so as others said, you're losing an important ally in the kind of more liberal economic camp. But if we want to think on the positive side, right, for Ireland, that means naturally that you become more of a leader, you know, to the extent your governments continue to, you know, favor that kind of economic policy, you become a natural leader of that group within the EU, and your voice, you know, can be, becomes all the more central. And I would just say, you know, again, while there's going to be a lot of pain associated with Brexit because of your close trade ties with the UK, which would be damaged, there are upsides too. We've already, from what I read in the papers, you know, Dublin officials are over in the City of London, you know, inviting people to move banking jobs over here, and that's just beginning because it's not just banking, service industries. You know, people talk about the UK. That for decades the UK's functioned as a kind of battleship, they say, for foreign direct investment, where companies would situate themselves there to access the European market. They're becoming less attractive in that regard, obviously, with leaving the EU. But Ireland, as it has, you know, for decades, has made itself attractive, not just because of tax, but because you have an educated workforce, you speak English, generally pro-business, regulatory environment. All those things remain true, and you've lost an important competitor.
Well, we've a housing issue as well, but we'll move on swiftly from that. I want to open it maybe up to the floor, because I know there will be a lot of people who will want to take part. So if you're happy to just maybe even identify who you are and where you're from, and like Davina on Big Brother, we're live, so do not swear. Thank you. So maybe just go to this gentleman at the back, and then we'll go to this lady in the middle. Thank you. We've got about 15 minutes for this, so please do take part. Let me know if you want to direct the question to the panel in general or to someone in particular, but not me.
My name is Dave Reynolds, and I'm a staff member at DCU. I have two questions related to the border issue. First of all, how would the UK and Europe see other borders like that between Gibraltar and the Channel Islands? Is there any view emerging there? Because obviously there should be some facade of consistency. And then my other question is, I'm just ignorant of the answer. Since 1922, have there been any regulation of trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom? So has there been in any sense a border between the six counties and Great Britain? Because we know there are differences. There are registrations in the north are not the same as the rest of the UK.
Okay.
Hey, so on Gibraltar, maybe Daniel can speak about just general things as well. But I think it's important to note that I don't think examples will be used from, they have been used from other cases for Northern Ireland, but a lot of the emphasis in talk of the border is that Northern Ireland is different because of the conflict. So in a lot of the language, and I think in a lot of the policy, and I think a lot of the political will, is recognising that Northern Ireland is a different case. And I would say that is a preference for Irish governments and for the EU, because initially when the Brexit referendum occurred, there were fears that Spain would not agree to any kind of different arrangements at all for the Irish border because of Catalonia.
And that was in the media, and also politicians, diplomats were very concerned, but that actually never emerged. And the reason was that gradually, very quickly, actually, a consensus emerged that Northern Ireland is really a case apart. The word special status has very different political connotations and is sensitive, but it's not the case that we can use whatever is found as a solution for Northern Ireland for Gibraltar or vice versa, because they are very deliberately being kept separate. So I would nearly not go any further than saying that. I don't know, is Daniel anything about that?
I haven't studied the Gibraltar issue closely, but I would just say a very simple formula. If you're not in the single market and the customs union, you have to have border checks. Full stop.
Well, it's quite very famous when Barnier went looking for the document back from the 1920s. There wasn't one. Again, it was sort of a bespoke Irish solution to the Irish problem.
Could I just
yes.
on the second question, I mean, we have, as we've again probably all familiar with the common travel area, where freedom of movement of goods and people. As you say, clearly car duties are different in the UK and Ireland, so there would be administrative checks, to use that term, about that. And the other time, I mean, when there have been issues around sort of the foot and mouth disease and issues like that, but that kind of really created cooperation cross-border to minimise that coming from Britain.
And I think one of the influential things in this debate has been, and I suppose I'm quite close to it because I'm from the border between Newry and Dundalk, but I think what was always overlooked in the debate about Brexit was just how fundamental the single market and the customs union in particular, because the first shots of the conflict were shot across the border. So to protect the customs officials, the police were drafted in, the army were drafted in, next minute we had all these superstructures all over the Northern Ireland. But the reverse was true, that our membership of the single market and our membership of the customs union in particular paved the way for the ultimate demilitarisation. So I think there is sort of there's a unique narrative in the north, but for me, I still think the biggest one is the psychological one. There was a lady, I think, here just in the front, and then we'll go to the gentleman behind and the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Noelle O'Connell from Dublin City University, PhD candidate at the School of Law and Government. My question is related to the outcome of Brexit in terms of EU-UK economic relations. Assuming that Great Britain would leave the customs union, and that this will lead to a preferential agreement with the EU, do you think that this would stimulate the other third countries which are having an agreement with the EU, like Canada, Norway, or recently Japan? Would they stimulate them to attempt to replicate this type of a potential preferential agreement with Britain? Thank you.
Daniel or Noelle?
Okay, I can say something first and then others. Well, when you say preferential, if I understood you correctly, so you're suggesting that they would get something like that's, let's say, a Canada plus or something like that, something that is more than one of the free trade deals. I think there's a lot of misconception around this discussion of these different models, and especially this term bespoke, right? Because basically every FTA, free trade agreement, is bespoke. They're all a bit different, right? And none of them are exactly the same. And so in that sense, sure, it'll be bespoke. That being said, the EU is not going to allow the kind of cherry picking, as it's called, which is, you can have, let's say, total free movement of goods, but not listen to ECJ judgments and not allow free movement of people, those sort of things. So it'll be an FTA, and it might be a bit more far-reaching, right, if they can manage it, right? Could it have some aspects of services? Perhaps. It's very difficult. Not many FTAs do, but it's not inconceivable. But I mean, I guess your question was sort of framed as, if the UK gets some special deal, would the others demand it? I would view it more as, if the UK and EU manage to negotiate something that goes even further to deeper free trade, then the EU would probably be happy to do that with Canada as well. But I don't think it's going to be, there's not going to be many pluses after the Canada plus. It might be a little more, but nothing dramatically different.
pillars are the pillars.
Yeah, just to follow on from that point, we've heard about the red, white, blue, bespoke, hard, soft Brexit. I mean, it's a culinary colour.
Scrambled.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a, I don't know, Scrabble board or Twister or something. I think just something to bear in mind, and I'm just actually back from London, so having these conversations with some colleagues in the UK, it's always informative and interesting. The EU cannot allow somebody that is leaving the club, and it goes back to Dearbhail's earlier question, in terms of solidarity. If you are paying your subscription and you're a paid-up member, if I want to join a gym and go to spinning class and use the swimming pool and use the weights, I will pay a monthly subscription. Why should somebody leaving still be allowed to go to the spinning class and maybe use the swimming pool every second weekend? It's just not...
If you go to Super Spin, you have to pay extra.
Well, there you go. But so in terms of the trade deal for the UK, it's important to point out the most straightforward trade deal, and they are by their very nature complex, to put it mildly, that the EU negotiated was with Korea, and I think that took 7 years. When Greenland was disengaging, and I know it's not like for like in terms of looking at population and size, but 55,000 population and one issue, fish, and that took a couple of years. I mean, this is so complex, and it would be a very brave person in light of the developments and how quickly evolving the debate is going in terms of the trade, as to how one would speculate as to how it is all going to pan out. But I think I have a Brexit countdown clock on my computer, sad I know, but there's about 430 days to go to the 29th of March. The European Parliament, or Politico, I think, did a really interesting article on that there was 20,844 regulations that needed to be looked at. You're looking at, if you take 10 regulations an hour, which is completely impossible. So the complexity around it, and in terms of the trade, it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be straightforward.
And what are your views then on the resolution of the Irish question? Do you think there should be fluidity about that? Because obviously the EU and Britain ultimately want to get on to the trade talks. Where are we at our height? Where do we best deploy the leverage that we have? And is there a concern that if we are kind of much more fluid now, that we might lose out when we get on to the big guns of the trade talks?
Well, I suppose the first thing I would say is, I think Ireland respectfully and assertively, but not excessively aggressively, managed our leverage very well in phase 2. We're also going to be a separate strand in the negotiations phase 1 rather, in phase 2. I mean, the March Council is going to be very important in that regard. I think...
How long, though, can we plead the special case?
Yeah.
And actually, should we be pleading the special case? Because often we think of Europe in terms of what we get for it. But I think the big debate in Ireland is what are we going to be prepared to give in this new talk. So what, because I've travelled a lot talking about Brexit, both here and abroad in the last, since the vote. And it's amazing how far down the list of priorities Brexit is, the further away from the nucleus of the Brexit debate that you go.
Yeah.
And you're over there, and can we actually, even with the North and with other issues and the economy and our exposure to the UK, how long can we plead a special case, and how does the narrative in Ireland need to change if it does? Anyone?
Well, a couple of points, if I may, just on that. The EU, and Dearbhail, you'll know this, the peace funding that was given to Northern Ireland was a really strong part in underpinning and providing support for that dialogue and the peace process to take place. You're absolutely right. If I talk to my colleagues in Serbia or Estonia, they're not concerned about Brexit. As I referenced our survey, it's not in the 50% of them, it's not in their top 3 priorities. They're more concerned with the
and the same for business groups across the UK.
Absolutely.
Across Europe.
So Ireland is a special case, but we're not solely a special case. A lot of the different member states are also, the majority are not happy to see the UK leave. It's the loss of a business voice, a liberal voice, and so they too are going to be impacted by the UK leaving. So we are a special case, but a lot of other, like if you look at, you were mentioning the Dutch politician, and the port of Rotterdam is going to be hugely impacted as well. Calais in France. So it's very interwoven and multifaceted. But I think we have to continue shaping and influencing and reaching out and engaging and trying to understand to a greater degree maybe that we have before, what are the concerns and priorities of our fellow member states and how we want to trade and engage and relate with them, because it is going to be different and we are going to have compromise, we are going to have some wins, we are going to have some losses, and not every sector is going to win on everything. And I think we need to be mature about that, and I think we probably need to be a little bit honest on it.
Daniel, can I ask you, you miss voices, and you know, it was interesting at Peter Sutherland's funeral, the priest said that perhaps sometimes his embrace of the good side of globalisation blurred some of the bad bits. I thought it was a really interesting remark, but you would miss voices like Peter Sutherland, perhaps people like John Hume, you know, to the fore in a debate at this time. How is Europe going to move on from the foundational narrative, which may not have the same relevance to current generations, especially given the fractures? What is going to be, do you think, the narrative that's going to emerge out of all of this?
Well, yeah, I think that's a great question, because the foundational narrative of overcoming war just doesn't resonate as much with the young generation who can take peace in Europe for granted, right? And so there needs to be a new narrative. I think the big mistake, which your president kind of alluded to in his discussion in recent years in EU policymaking, was that you know, they basically created the impression, in some cases the reality, right, that the top policy priority above all was the imposition of austerity, right, in a very inflexible way. I think, you know, they need to move beyond that, because that was, you know, clearly a very negative narrative fueling populism on the left and right in many states. So what is the new narrative, your question? You know, I think, you know, this idea of a Europe that promotes growth and that promotes freedom, right? And that basically, I think this narrative about protection, even though it's maybe buying a little bit into some of the fears stoked by the populace, it can be effective, that sort of, you know, countries are too small to be totally on our own in this world of big powers, and, you know, Europe is a club that can protect us, right? With things like stronger common defense, where there's a lot of public support for that, right? You know, intelligence, things like that. And even, you know, on the external border, right? Saying, well, we can't really police our borders individually, then the whole system breaks down, because people just go on to the next border.
And Tim, what about that, you know, intelligence and trust and the good side of the British-Irish relationship, notwithstanding, you know, various difficult times, but that has built up between these two islands, and that alliances that we didn't fall in behind them a lot, but the UK did a lot of the heavy lifting when it came to some key strands in Europe.
Yeah, I think, actually, I just wanted to say about the Irish government's chances of success in prioritising Northern Ireland going forward, and then talk about that. I think the advantage for the Irish government is it's a priority, and it's a key priority. It doesn't have the same complexity that the UK government will have. So I'd say it could, you know, it's going to be tough. Everyone says the next phase will be tough, but I think it is very much the Irish government's priority, and small states can be remarkably successful with a narrow range of issues to deal with. So I would say it will continue lobbying as it has done so successfully. On trust, I think it's back to what I was saying. I think it's another sort of chip or factor in the whole changed context, which I think could diminish trust. But I think there's a will on both sides to keep that trust going, but it's nearly by default it might go. And maybe, I mean, my perception is particularly on the British side, there isn't enough emphasis about how important that relationship is, but also how it needs to be nurtured. It's not something a bit like the younger generation taking peace for granted. It can't be taken for granted. So I think there is a will to keep trust going and develop it, but there are so many factors which have changed which make it less easy. So I think it needs commitment.
One or two more questions just
Madam
before
Chair,
we wrap up. Yes. There's a gentleman there, yes, there are just two there. This gentleman here just beside Mr. Vickers, or behind. And thanks for your questions. It's a really engaging debate. Hi there.
Colin after retired Department of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much to all the panels for a very rich discussion. And excuse my horses, I have a slight cold. I had about 5 questions, but they've been gradually knocked off my list. So I'll keep it fairly brief. It's something which Noelle and indeed you, Dearbhail, mentioned, but you, Etain, mentioned as well. To what extent do the British not anticipate that we would use our leverage, to use Noelle's phrase, in terms of sustainable negotiations? It seems to be something that they haven't quite realised, that we would actually, we Ireland, be prepared to would call the collapse of self-nationalism in Northern Ireland. This is something that Eamon Ali, to some extent Mark Matthew O'Toole has mentioned. Traditional SDLP type voters are now voting for Sinn Féin because they're totally alienated from unionism. But this was happening before Brexit, which is certainly now exacerbated by it. And finally, the gentleman who asked about Gibraltar. I'm not an expert, but it's very interesting. There's at least one statement from the Chief Minister of Gibraltar travelling to London and meeting by name several members of the DUP. So clearly there's a lot of interest trafficking back both between the DUP side of things and the Chief Minister of Gibraltar. Thank you all very much.
That's fantastic. Noelle, you might go first.
Sure, and I'll keep. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you,
And
Colin.
you will be keeping it brief.
I will
We're
be keeping
nearly
it brief.
at coffee time.
Yeah, just a couple of things. One of the most unfortunate things I think of Brexit has been the fracturing and the deterioration in the quality of relationships between Ireland and the UK, and on all levels, be it a government official, business, civil society, you name it. And you're absolutely right, Colin. I mentioned I was just back from London, and in all the conversations I had, I nearly felt like getting my Irish rugby jersey out. I mean, there was such. How do I put this politely? Anger, I suppose, that who did we think we were? And that was what I was being said to every second coffee meeting I was having.
How dare they?
How dare we? And our size, and yes, we are small, but we are mighty, was also referred to. And because when the UK talks to the bigger member states, there's an understanding that Ireland cannot be allowed to hold it up. And I was like, well, it doesn't quite work like that. We're still going to be a member of the club, and we have the solidarity of the 26 other member states, and we want this to work. And I think that goes back to the basis that Etain spoke about. I think in time, it's just a little bit of a blip. All relationships go through peaks and troughs, and we need to work in it. We need a bit of counselling. We need to develop it. But the basis, I think, is there, and the goodwill is there. But it has taken a blip. It has taken a bit of a dip. But it is not in our interests for the UK to get a bad Brexit deal, and I think that's important that we recognise that.
Yeah, I think that I'd agree with Noelle. I don't know how far the deterioration is to do with the Tory government being in power as well. I remember Garrett Fitzgerald in his memoirs said that the Conservative government typically, this in the 80s and generally, I think he meant, didn't really look anywhere other than the southeast of England in terms of where it thought mattered. So, clearly people in the north of England weren't much considered in policy, according to him, either. So I'm not sure how far what's happening at the moment, that kind of attitude you've mentioned about, how dare we, is a reflection of that kind of conservative approach in the Tory party, which, as I said, would also probably have a similar view of northern regions of the UK. Apart from that, I don't know how they miscalculated so often, not just about that the Irish government would succeed in getting Northern Ireland prioritised and continue with that, but in so many ways. There's a book by Ivor Crewe and Anthony King, the late Anthony King from Essex, about great blunders the UK has made through time, and I mean, this just is a whole set of them. So I don't know how that's happening, but one aspect is the government, the Tory party as well.
I might just very quickly just address your point. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, Chairman. Jerry Devon, Irish Academy of Engineering. Just one question relating really to Daniel's last slide. It's reported that there are twice as many crossing points on the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland as there are on the EU's eastern border between the north of Finland and the south of Greece. Now, effectively, that clearly sets a serious problem in terms of just any implementation of a border or a hard border. And you would say that logically, the situation is you put crossing points at Larne, Belfast Harbour, and Warden Point, until you look at it from Northern Ireland's perspective, and you realise that every man, woman, and child in Northern Ireland receives £5,000 a year from the English taxpayer. And that's a very significant and long-term view. So how we're going to square that, I don't know. I wish I knew.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is the very huge and significant subvention that Northern Ireland receives to the tune of 10 billion sterling a year. I have not seen any solution yet presented that deals with the with the border. Obviously, the DUP does not want to be treated any differently. It was interesting. I was over speaking to a Scottish delegation about the border issue, you know, and once it seemed that Northern Ireland's getting any sense of a special deal, well, then suddenly they were seeking that too. But just to speak to your point on the political map in Northern Ireland, because not since partition has it actually been as divided as it is today. If you look, there's a brilliant map, the BBC and others have it, of Northern Ireland after the last elections. And all of the border counties are green. Yeah. The rest are the DUP, and there's a wee tiny splash of pink in North Down with Sylvia Harman. And you do ask yourself, and I grew up in Newry, in the Newry in South Armagh, and it's extraordinary even to watch how my own constituency has changed from being moderate nationalism and moderate unionism to this kind of chasm. You know, and you do ask, well, where is the voice of moderate nationalism? Where is the voice of moderate loyalism? Where is the voice of moderation in Northern Ireland? Because that political map does not reflect I think, the will of the people in Northern Ireland, and I think that was reflected in the Brexit vote itself, with the extent of the Remain vote there, and it's kind of one of those things that is really quite staggering. I think in that sense, and the Good Friday Agreement, I think has, you know, do we need to tweak it in terms of, you know, power sharing has delivered a lot, but it hasn't delivered in other senses, and particularly for that. And no third way, no middle ground has come in yet in Northern Ireland, and it hasn't been kind of allowed to. And you know, it could take 1 or 2 elections to really flip that percentage. And the other thing, obviously, to watch, I do not subscribe to demographics being destiny, but there is no doubt that demographics is going to play a significant role in Northern Ireland within the next 20 to 30 years. The island of Ireland is going to return to pre-famine levels of population across the entire island by 2040. A lot of that will be inward migration. It's not going to be, you know, for want of a better word, Indigenous Irish. So there are lots of factors at play. I recently attended an event, and I'll perhaps just close out on this with your indulgence. I recently met Seamus Mallon, who'd been this kind of hero in as a child and still now. And he just, you know, he talked about how there is no other way. We have to work with each other, and we have to break down the other. And I think that it applies equally on the island of Ireland as it does across the bloc. And I hope perhaps that the Brexit, with all of the insanity, as Peter Southern predicted, that it has wrought, might also, in a sense, perhaps, on a positive note, lead to a renaissance of our own values, and perhaps even across the bloc. And with that, only 4 minutes late, I'm going to deliver your chair coffee to thank all the panellists and to thank you for your time and participation. Thank you.